Final part, the Infernal City. Jason looked down at the world passing by underneath him. He looked down in what would have been wonder, but now is a deep anxiety. What is going to happen to the world? Jason looked down at the people below, all unaware of the potential disaster at hand. Even Jason was unaware at just what scale the destruction would manifest itself. Jason felt the fur of Kamazot's, holding as tightly as he could as to not fall off. This is crazy, he thought. A mere few days ago he was on a plane, excited for what he thought was going to be a vacation. But now he was caught up in a fight for Earth against opponents of unknown, of unknowable strength. But he was fighting. When Kamazot's first attacked his house, he would have been helpless if not for meeting Isabel. When he was trapped in the ballpark, he was just trying to survive, to escape. That was flight, not fight. But now he knew that Long was dead and that Simon would not be much help without his home field advantages. He did not know how Isabel was doing, just that she had to be alone now in a city that must be swarming with monsters. All he knew for sure is that the overwhelming feeling of powerlessness that had been building over the last couple of days had been replaced with a do-or-die attitude. He had Kamazot's, and when he made it into the city, he would be an ally for Isabel. He was not going to stand by. He had the means to fight against Jonah even if Jason did not have full understanding of the nature of the thing he was fighting against. Jason was shaken by these thoughts by the sound of a large grunt exhaled by Kamazot's. Jason looked down at the monster-infested city below. They had arrived. There was a high barrier in place around the city, and creatures patrolling the ground around it. Many strange beings whose middle was made up of the head of a lion, surrounding that was 5 legs jutting off in different places. It rolled itself quickly along with these legs. Behind these were a crowd of strange riders on camels, alligators, horses. Jason decided to fly over these creatures and the barrier, braving the creatures with wings that flew above the barrier. There were many of these beings flying over the city, but they were not nearly as densely packed as the group patrolling the outskirts. Jason gave his orders to Kamazot's, who swooped forward to enter the city from above, but not without attracting the attention and resistance of the winged monstrosities guarding the infernal city. A large regal-looking black bird was the first to attack. In its hand was a blade. With astounding agility, this bird crashed into the side of Kamazot's, driving the blade in. Jason held on tight as the bat quickly spun around, almost shaking Jason off. Kamazot's grabbed the bird beast by the neck, bringing them to an abrupt stop. He ripped off its top beak with a yank, making a stomach-turning popping noise. He plunged this beak into the bird beast's chest. The bird spiraled to the ground. That was when backup arrived. There was the figure of a man with a snake in his left hand riding a dragon. There was a bipedal deer, long sharp antlers and bat wings jutting from its back. Finally flying in his direction was a man-sized raven, with long muscular arms that, had it not been for the feathers, seemed like they would be more at place on a gorilla. The raven had a posture similar to a great ape as well. All these creatures were steadily approaching, and Jason didn't have any course of action except hanging on for life, literally, and hoping that Kamazot's could handle these menacing threats. I guess I'm not really taking charge and fighting for myself, Jason thought. I'm still dependent on this monster that I enlisted outside of Xibalba. Kamazot's ripped out the thin fencing sword out of his side. He threw the sword at the dragon's rider. This jettisoned the rider off his dragon. The dragon stopped for a moment, confused without its rider. The winged deer reached him next. Kamazot's grabbed it by the arms, one in each hand, and bit into a wing, ripping it off. While the creature struggled, he broke off an antler and threw the one-winged creature down to the street below. It crashed to the ground with a sickening crunch. The dragon's rider had wings himself, and now he was trying to reposition in the air, reeling after having been hit by the sword thrown by Kamazot's. The rider's dragon went on his own to attack Kamazot's, gnashing jaws over claws, searching for an opening to attack. Kamazot's grabbed the lower jaw, letting the teeth sink into the flesh of his hand. He thrust the deer's antler into the dragon's eye, drove it far into the skull, creating a fulcrum in which to pull its jaw open to stop the teeth from gnawing its hand. But Kamazot's didn't stop at opening the dragon's mouth. He just tightened the grip on its lower jaw, pulling the mandible. It cracked and the skin of the neck ripped, blood exploding outward from the wound. Jason looked back and saw the Raven Man approaching, its long arms within reach. Jason slid down Kamazot's back, narrowly dodging the impact of the Raven crashing into Kamazot's. The Raven thrust its long arms around Kamazot's neck, trying to get him into a hold. At the same time, it was blocking the movement of Kamazot's wings, causing him to struggle to keep altitude. Kamazat's dropped the dragon, whose dead weight sent it spiraling downwards before reaching back to grab one of the raven's arms, twisting it, breaking it. He pulled the arm forward, catapulting the bird over his shoulder, its arm breaking off, this barely lessening the momentum and sending the bird cruising in an arc through the air. The dragon's rider flew towards Kamazat's, who threw the raven's arm at the rider's face. This moment of distraction experienced by the dragon's rider was all it took for Kamazat's to get a hold of him, an arm in one hand, a foot in the other. Kamazat's held the rider underneath his feet as he fell out of the sky at an increasing acceleration, hurtling towards the ground. When Kamazat's did crash feet first into the ground, the cement cracked underneath him, and it was far worse than cracking for the creature that was held beneath his feet when he landed. The demon was left an unrecognizable broken heap. Jason climbed off of Kamazat's, legs shaking on solid ground. Kamazat's let out a loud grunt while looking in Jason's direction. Jason turned around so fast he almost fell. The raven was running in his direction, blood pouring out of the hole in its shoulder, the socket where his arm did attach before it was ripped out. The other arm was outstretched towards him. His legs were still stiff from riding through the air. They would not pull him out of the way. If Kamazat's were to save him, he would need to quickly find a way of getting around Jason as to block any incoming attacks by the creature. There wasn't the time to fly above him. Jason was almost in the raven's reach. Before the raven could reach him, however, something jumped out of an alleyway beside it, tackling it to the ground. There was a thrashing about as the raven spun and tumbled, trying to shake its assailant, but to no avail. The hunched figure stood over the body of the raven's head dangling off the spinal column that the creature had gripped in its jaws. The beast that attacked it was stooped over the raven, back bending at an angle that was uncomfortable to look at. It was bipedal and its features were vaguely canine. Although it was hideous to look at, it had saved his life. Out of the alleyway that it had emerged from, a familiar figure appeared. Isabel! Jason ran over to her. She gave him a tired smile, obviously crestfallen due to the events in the quarantine and caught off guard by his enthusiasm. "We have to get off the streets, Jason. Follow me." She pulled him through the alley and into a door. Her eyes darting around the room to make sure it was safe, and quickly determining it was, closed the door, locking it behind her. The room was dark. The only thing lighting the room was what little sunlight came in through the blinds covering the window. "What the hell is going on in this town?" Jason asked, again realizing how little he understood about the situation, but he found some solace in the fact that he was not alone. If this quarantine proved anything at all, it proved that the others around him were fighting as hard as they could against this unknown threat whose nature they understood little more than himself. The quarantine was taken over by Jonah. She hated associating the name of Jonah with that monster, and her voice was shaking thinking of what happened to Long, a man who she had worked for over a year. "He slaughtered the people in the quarantine. We created it, that damn barrier to keep Jonah in, but instead we just trapped an entire city in with that monster. It sacrificed them, spilled their blood on the streets in order to summon more creatures, and for what?" Isabel slammed a fist against the table. "To become vile? That was the last thing I heard over the radio. That thing said that it wanted to become Baal, whatever that means, and then it killed Chief Long. So what can we do?" Asked not out of bravery or a willingness to run into battle, but just as a continuance of him letting the events carry him to whatever destination they were carrying him to. He was spent, emotionally, and now the only thing fueling him was compulsion, the same as his father's compulsion, to see what these events are leading up to. "I found a truck. It's a freight truck. It's carrying gasoline. I plan to blow up the creature's summoning circle. It'll be a big circle, I presume, based on what he is trying to accomplish, the amount of lives he took to accomplish it. Once it starts, I'll stop it from at least completing the ritual." "Do you know where or when it's happening?" "Yeah, I know it's happening in the center of town, because that place has been basically inaccessible, and the circle was drawn there earlier today. It should be happening soon. I've been watching it from inside here, waiting until the last minute where there would be the best opening to strike." Isabel pulled the blinds back from the window. A large circle was drawn on the ground outside of the building. Jonah was standing in the center. He was chanting. There was a large mass behind him, a gigantic seething red mass. And it was growing, pulling in more of that congealed crimson fluid from throughout the town. It was blood, Jason thought. That towering mass, that gigantic scab, he thought with a shudder. It's a combination of countless people's blood slaughtered in order for Jonah to orchestrate his transformation. "I was going to drive the truck as far into the circle as I could before it was destroyed. That would have been suicide. But then I saw you. You got here just in time," she continued with a smile, ignoring his outburst. Now I have a new plan. We'll wait until the last minute, when Jonah is completely distracted by his transformation. Then you'll fly around on Kamazats above him as a further distraction while I pull the gas tanker around and ignite it, blowing up the summoning circle. Then we'll grab Jonah's book and... She clapped her hands. That'll be that. We'll have him. Without the book, you can't summon any more monsters. That's the best plan I can come up with. Sounds good to me. A flash of purple entered through the window. The circle on the ground outside was glowing. Different monsters were throwing themselves into that now brightly glowing, luminescent tower of congealed blood. Jonah himself spread his arms, letting himself be consumed by the shivering crimson mass. It's time to go, Jason. She grabbed his arm. Her blue eyes looked deep into his. You ready? With Jonah melting into that column of gore outside, it was time to move, Isabel thought. She was running towards the door of the small building they were in, Jason following behind her. She slung the door open only for a bipedal panther to lunge its claws in her direction. She pushed Jason backwards, the panther hitting the door, giving it pause for only a moment. It turned with gnashing jaws. It was about to pounce. Before it had a chance to, Isabel raised her arm, and as she did, an arc of lightning shot from her gloved hands, sending the panther man flying backwards, bouncing off the brick wall behind it. With that, Isabel and Jason were back onto the street. Okay, you fly up with Kamazats. I'll pull the truck around. Isabel ran by Jason, who started to run in the opposite direction. She was heading deeper into the alleyway, where she had parked the truck in, hopefully, a safe space. She examined her gloved hand while walking. The white fabric was stained red. She realized she was firing off lightning bolts at a rate that is becoming seriously damaging. She smiled as she reached the truck, 16 wheels, large metal gas shipper container on the back. It was still safe. She jumped into the car excitedly, her blood temperature rising. For the next couple of seconds she knew, with the chaos in the streets and her trying to drive down it in this truck, she was going to be basically a moving bomb. She pulled out of the alleyway and onto the street. Her hound ran alongside the truck next to her. It wasn't a bat monster the height of a two-story building, but it saw her out in a pinch. Now on the main road leading to the town center where the summoning circle was, she saw there wasn't many monsters in the road. There must have been a lot of them that jumped into that crimson blob for the ritual, Isabel thought. However, not a moment after thinking this, she spotted something ahead in the road. It was like a troll? That was the best word Isabel could think to describe it. A 10-foot lithe troll, fur covering its body, horns upon its head, and then there were its strange hands. Where its fingers should be, it had 5 glowing candles, and it stood turning them in the air. It turned its gaze on the truck, and pointed with its candlestick hand, spinning the fingers, the lights turning in air. It was almost hypnotizing. At the speed Isabel was going, it was too late to turn around. She had to continue moving forward. The troll pulled its hand back and released a fireball in her direction. Isabel swung the truck around just in time to dodge it. The truck's wheels going on and back off the sidewalk as the fireball almost hit the gas tanker on the back. Isabel's hound ran ahead to attack the troll, distracting it from the tanker for a moment. Isabel looked in the rearview mirror as the hound was thrown. The troll's hands were brought backward to throw more fireballs. She turned the wheel, but there was too many of them. She kept spinning the wheel and it seemed that she wouldn't be able to turn fast enough. The truck turned, falling on its side, skidding across the ground. Isabel opened her eyes and found herself covered in a strange purple glow. As she slowly got her bearings, she realized what had happened. The glow was the light of the summoning circle, pouring into the passenger side window that was on the ground. She had at least gotten the truck to where it needed to be. Now to get out of it before that thing shooting fireballs blows me up sky high. She unbuckled her seatbelt, falling down out of the seat. She tried the handle, but it would not open. Tried hitting the door, but it was damaged. It wouldn't open. She raised her blood-stained glove. Knock the door off, but don't explode the car. She repeated the phrase in her head as a mantra as she steadied her shaking, damaged hand. A lightning bolt exploded from her hand, sending the door flying. The noise it made within that tight space was enough to rattle the eardrums, but Isabel did not worry about the ringing in her ears. She felt the skin of her hand tear when she let loose that bolt of lightning. Blood was dripping down her arm. She ignored the pain, pulling herself out of the vehicle, onto the glowing concrete below. Purple light reflecting off the sheen of her black leather biking jacket. A giant spider leg crossed the path behind her. It was attached to a mammoth creature, what Jonah had transformed into. However, she had no time to worry about that, to look back at what it was. Ahead of her the troll was still there, and its candlestick-covered hand was reared back for another throw. She was running as fast as she could towards the troll, which was dangerous, but not as dangerous as staying where she was. The troll was aiming at her, but when the fireball missed, and it would miss, Isabel had at least that much faith in her ability to dodge. It was going to hit the gas tanker. The troll threw the fireball. Isabel leapt to the side, landing on her front on the sidewalk. In the moments before the impact between the troll's fireball and the gas tanker, Isabel did her best to cover her head in her hands, flattened her body against the ground, hoping the mailbox behind her, anything, would serve as some cover. Had she made it far enough away from the tanker to survive? Isabel's eyes were closed as tightly as she could manage. Likewise her arms or hands covered her face. However, even in that state she remembered a flash of light and a loud explosion. She raised up slowly back onto her feet, realizing she had survived. Her hair and clothes were covered in a reddish and dark gray dust of debris as cement and bricks from the ground and from the buildings was sent showering back down. Isabel covered her mouth with her jacket as she walked. The debris particles were also heavy in the air. Oh no. She was limping forward in the fog of debris. Shining through that mist was the glowing hands of the troll. The light was floating closer, and before long a fireball was thrown in her direction. She fell and rolled to the left of it. The troll appeared out of the mist, running in her direction. Isabel raised her hand, aching and covered in burns and cuts as it was, gloves stained blood red, and shot back in its direction. The lightning hit its hands. Fire fell to the left and right of the troll, who staggered back and fell. Isabel's arm fell back down. The pain in it was now beginning to become worryingly numb. It seemed impossible to lift it back up. Isabel let out a groan as the troll began to stand up. But out of the mist came the hound, quickly running forward on all fours and leaping in the troll's direction. Isabel let out a sigh of relief. Without its fire, it seemed the troll was powerless, and the hound gripped its throat in its strong jaws and ripped it open. Isabel found her way to the sidewalk and lowered herself in a sitting position, pulling her jacket back over her mouth in order to stop inhaling the floating debris. She pulled the glove off her hand. The rune was now dust floating on the large bleeding lacerations of her palm, a rip that seemed to cover her entire hand. She leaned her head back against the wall behind her. She was tired, and no amount of urgency in the situation seemed to be enough to get her back up. The hound walked over and stood in front of her in a seemingly protective, defensive stance. Isabel weakly patted its head with her left, non-injured hand. It's up to you now, Jason, she thought, before her exhaustion overtook her. Jason followed Isabel as she ran towards the door, opening it. Before running out, however, she stopped to push him back. Jason's mouth dropped as a bolt of lightning exited her hand. Afterwards, they both exited the door. Outside there was a bipedal panther lying on the ground, still smoking from the bolt that had hit it. Okay, you fly up with Kamazats. I'll pull the truck around. Jason ran in the opposite direction of Isabel, towards the opening of the alley where he could turn onto the street and summon Kamazats. As soon as he started running along the street, he screamed, Kamazats! The monster floated down, appearing seemingly out of thin air. Distracted by this magnificent sight, Jason almost did not notice the saber moving in his direction before it was too late. Something was charging towards him, sword pointed outwards, like a jouster, but only one side in this duel was with lance and steed. Jason backed off to the side, turning too quick and falling down onto the street, saber mere centimeters from puncturing his chest. The one with the saber was an owl-headed man, and he was riding a large black wolf. The rider spun his wolf back around, but this time Jason was aware of him, and Kamazats was ready. The owl-headed rider drove his wolf back in their direction. Jason moved to the left, out of the way the best he could, and Kamazats charged forward as well. The two clashed, Kamazats pulling the rider off its wolf. The rider's saber flying forward out of its hand and onto the concrete, the wolf sent tumbling forward without its rider. The owl-headed man and Kamazats were to grapple, both of their wings flapping, carrying them a few feet off of the ground. The owl's beak plunged into Kamazats' neck, Kamazats' large teeth thrashing at the monstrosity's shoulder. The wolf turned back around, its sights not set on the grapple between its rider and its foe, but on the defenseless Jason. Jason's arms raised to his chest, palms forward as if saying, See, I'm not a threat. Jason was backing slowly. No plan on where to go. There was no place he could go to escape from the wolf, and running would be impossible. Jason's agility was nowhere close enough to match the wolf's. The wolf began that slow, ducked trot that Jason had seen before in documentaries and in films, where the wolf slowly circled its prey, back down, legs ready to pounce. Kamazat's got a hold of one of his assailant's wings, slinging the rider down onto the ground. The owl-headed rider began to crawl away. Kamazat's grabbed him by his two legs, pulling him off of the ground. The rider began to flap his wings, trying to get back into that grappling duel the two were having before. However, Kamazat slung him in an arc where he couldn't reorient himself, crashing the creature into the side of a building, its spine breaking. Kamazat stood over the creature, his only movement was spasms and twitches. It was not going to get back up. Kamazat was distracted from this sight awarded to him through a successful skirmish by a scream. The wolf in front of Jason pounced in his direction. Jason let out a loud yell, falling to the ground. Jason's hands landed on the owl-headed rider's saber that had flown out of its hand. Jason quickly thrusted this defensively forward as the wolf landed upon him, claws stretched in his direction. Kamazat ran to where he heard the scream of his summoner. The wolf was lying there over what must be his summoner, Jason. Pushing the wolf aside, Kamazat noticed it was already still, dead. A large gash opened from its chest to its stomach. Jason was lying there, eyes still wide and shot from the moment the wolf pounced. He was holding a saber covered in the blood of the creature summoned out of the Akashic. Kamazat pulled Jason to his feet, looking down at his summoner. Its mouth was twisted upwards, baring its sharp, menacing teeth in a way one could describe as a smile. Kamazat almost looked proud gazing down at Jason who had killed the wolf. "Let's go, Kamazat." Jason grabbed onto the creature with one hand, the other still holding the saber. Kamazat flew them both upward into the air. Below them the glowing summoning circle, with the large red pulsating tower that had swallowed Jonah in the center. As they flew above it, Jason noticed the tower began to boil, growing and giving it new form. It became vaguely round, 8 legs spreading out of a hairy body. Out of the top boiled out a large frog head, mouth gaping. Beside this, another head was attempting to emerge. It was a cat head, fighting against a slimy film covering it, teeth gnashing as if it was fighting its way out of the body. There was one other head emerging. It was a human head, features swimming around a formless face. Eventually these features found their place, the shape of the head solidified. It was Jonah's head, only gigantic and topped with a crown that was in place between the frog and cat heads. Jonah began laughing. The frog and cat head may have been attempting to laugh, but their expressions and noises escaping their mouths were nothing like that of a human's, or like those of the animals they seemed to be in the form of. The noise omitted by them, their expressions inspiring only revulsion and dread, whatever emotion they were attempting to convey was too unearthly to be understood or even easily tolerated by Jason. He looked away. What he saw below was a gas tanker driving towards the circle. "It's Isabel," Jason thought, seeing the gas tanker. "Alright, time to do this thing, Kamazat." Kamazat flew forward in front of Jason's face. This unearthly being that Jonah had become was so gigantic that there was no real conceivable way of fighting against it, only distracting it long enough for Isabel to drive that tanker into the circle. Jonah continued to smile, turning in Jason's direction. "Ah, is that you, Jason? You survived up until this point, I see." Giant spider legs were flailing upwards in Jason's direction, more playfully than anything else. Jonah was enjoying himself. "When I was assaulting the mind of Jonah and Zhao, of her and Isabel's parents, I learned what I needed about the abilities of Isabel, of Simon, of all those in the esoteric order. And the esoteric order, in all their studies, were of little threat to me. I knew that. The government, Long's organization, even less so. After Jonah offed himself, I had the perfect visage to crush the spirits of his friends. And through Zhao's parents, I had the perfect way to spread the infection of madness to her, to distract her mind while my consciousness took over. I was in the perfect position, ready to defeat him in this little spat of ours, and take over, without any unknown elements, without any loose ends. And then you showed up. That was exciting. Just some nobody who had no knowledge of what was happening around him. Have you learned how powerless you are? How insignificant?" Jonah stopped to laugh. The cat and frog joined in the merriment with their hisses and croaks. "It was a joy watching you learn how futile your fight was. You know, I thought I'd killed you in that ballpark. I thought you were finished when I trapped you there. But you did something better than die. You killed everyone else that was inside. Hundreds crushed in the implosion after you escape. It is one thing to watch my monsters kill people, but it was unimaginably more satisfying seeing you do it. Kamazat's was zigzagging between the long, hairy spider legs being thrown in their direction. Flying out of these, he began to fly straight into the air, Jonah looking in the opposite direction of the road Isabel would have to travel down. Kamazat's was rising up above the cityscape, presumably safe from the grasp of Jonah. That was what Jason thought until Kamazat's lurched backwards, nearly sending Jason flying off, which would have ended with him splattered across the ground. Jason looked down, and wrapped around Kamazat's leg was the frog's tongue, which had shot out, closing the distance between Jonah and Kamazat's. Kamazat's was flapping his wings as hard as he could, but this was a futile practice. They kept being dragged down, closer and closer to the gaping maw of the frog's mouth. Jonah just gave them a smirk, a raised eyebrow as if to say, "Yeah, this was inevitable." The cat releasing a guttural hiss, with what could be interpreted as a smile on its face. Jason thrashed the frog's tongue with the saber. The slash struck, shaking its tongue, but the saber got stuck to it, and he had to pull with all his might to dislodge the saber from the slime coating. The next hits were not connecting at all, the slime on the blades causing it to slip over the slick surface of the monster's tongue. Jason quickly tried to wipe the slime off of the blade with his shirt, which was difficult as he still had to hold as tightly as he could to Kamazat's, who himself was struggling to escape the frog's grasp. With the blade sufficiently clean, Jason returned his attention down towards the frog. It's too late, Jason thought. They were mere feet from the quivering jaws of the frog, whose hungry gaze was fixed upon them. It's over, Jason said aloud, to no one in particular. We're done. These were the final words Jason said before a deafening explosion sounded from below, as concrete was sent flying through the air, a column of fire and smoke rising beside them. The frog's tongue unraveled from Kamazat's legs. The frog's head began sizzling, boiling back into its spider body. The explosion had destroyed the summoning circle. The purple light being emitted from it was flashing, until finally going out completely. Isabel had done it. Kamazat's landed onto the ground. Jonah's beast continued to dissolve, the blood from all the sacrifices poured back onto the street, only now it had taken on a more purple complexion, and it was letting off steam despite the heat of the weather around it. Jonah was lying on the ground farther away, and Jason began to march towards him. Jonah raised back onto his feet, shaking his head, clearly angered over the dissolution of the creature he had become. Jonah turned in Jason's direction, who was now brandishing the saber. Jason ran forward, thrusting the saber as he ran past Jonah. There was a brief moment where Jonah stood still, just confused. Jason ran past him, thrusting his saber forward, but Jonah himself was left undamaged, untouched. But then Jonah saw what had been impaled on the end of the saber. Jason had a smile on his face, for at that moment he knew he had won. Hanging off the end of the saber was the grimoire, the Book of Shadows used by Jonah to summon all the demons that were possessing this infernal city. There were piles of burning rubbish after the explosion Isabel had caused. Jason simply stepped back beside one of these and turned the saber to where the book was over the fire, which quickly ignited the book in flames. "No, stop!" Jonah demanded, screaming, rushing Jason with outstretched arms. The entirety of Jonah's features were twisted into a rage upon seeing this. He grabbed Jason by the collar, shaking him as he let out a vicious snarl. "Stop!" A disembodied voice called down. "Attacking people directly was against the terms we established." "Damn it. You're right. I lost." He let out one more curse under his breath before that unknown entity left Jonah's body, which promptly crumbled to dust in front of Jason. "Congratulations, Jason, to you and to myself. We two had a bet between us that he couldn't take over our world without having to revert to his own powers. He could only use the powers of the Akashic, like you humans would have to. I bet on the side of the humans that the being that was known to some of you as having possessed Jonah would be defeated by a human. And I won that bet, so I thank you for playing an integral part of my success." Just part of a bet? Jason was fuming. All those lives lost, everything that was destroyed, all because of a bet? Two forgotten deities rolling around the Akashic decided to place bets, have a fun wager. Are our lives just a whim to them, something to play with? "Couldn't have done it without you." "That's right." Jason shouted at it, looking in the air at nothing in particular. The location of the voice was impossible to decipher. You couldn't have done it without me. I remember that. All of you. The spirit of mankind will always eventually succeed over you. This earth is ours, and we will never allow you to have it. With that outburst of righteous indignation behind him, Jason stood there huffing. He was so pissed. He knew what he said sounded childish, like something from a silly superhero comic. But he needed to get back at that being behind that voice in some way. He needed to lash at that which had destroyed the town around him, the cause of many horrors that haunted him over the past few days. The voice was silent for a few moments. The air was still and the silence was heavy. Jason knew that thing was still present, aware of what was happening, so the silence, the stillness of the air around him was becoming uneasy. Then he felt something wrapping around his chest, his torso squeezing him. He was being risen into the air. You seem to have misunderstood. The voice began, Jason just staring frantically into the empty space around him as he hovered in the air. I do not need anyone's permission to treat your world, as you call it, in any way that I please. I already own you, and your planet. I need only exert my will over it. Jason could not think of any response. He just merely hung there in the air, gasping for breath. The grip on his chest was tightening. He couldn't breathe. Even now you are not but entertainment for us, the eternal though unchanging beings of the Akashic. You are insignificant, powerless to the static consciousness rising out of man's collective unconsciousness. The human ego is fragile, and all will eventually melt back into that unconscious collective of the Akashic. Jason's vision was fading, darkening. His body was still fighting for breaths of air that the vice grip around his chest prevented. Yes, our existence will continue unbroken in there. That collective unconscious where instinct, archetypal myths, knowledge of magics, and other ideals that ensure mankind's continuance will survive. However, the individuating ego of all will dissipate, an ethereal drop in that ocean of morphogenesis. Individual consciousness condensing into existence and evaporating in the same instance. Jason had given up trying to breathe. His body stopped striving for that breath of life, both physically and mentally. Everything the creature said was unarguably true, the truth that Jason was so desperately compelled to find. By the time the veil of unconsciousness had taken him away, it was as if an old friend was returning to visit. He welcomed it. Jason once again found himself on the back of that great crocodile. The shining face made of two snake faces pointed at one another. The fearsome, beautiful face of Coatlicue looked down upon him. It felt like it had been a lifetime since he was last visited by her. Jason, my warrior for Earth. It is true that what is most important remains ever present, existing within the Akashic. The integral aspects of the collective unconscious of man remain unmoving and unchanging, even if some of them are represented in a variety of different forms. Different deities or figures throughout mankind's history. However, your world, the mortal world, operates on the opposite side of that same token. Mortal lives are ones of constant change. Birth, growth, degeneration, death, the patterns recognized as being part of these cycles are the only signs of order. You too are part of that cycle. But that is what it is, a cycle. Your struggles and emotions are whims of the day that will go unnoticed by the setting of the sun. Shake loose the hardships of today, and move on to the next day. Shed your skin and tackle what may come next, renewed. Jason awoke lying on the cold concrete, surrounded by rubble. Demolished buildings and the blood of hundreds who were murdered to raise a monster. There were flames scattering the ground randomly, and the atmosphere around him was polluted by debris and the smell of rot. Jason continued to lie there. What motivation was there to rise? Humanity is on a precipice. At any moment they could be assaulted by beings that see their suffering as nothing more than a pastime. Adding to the suffering of mankind would be seen as nothing more than play. How many more of these malevolent beings were there? How many beings are there indifferent to the lives of mankind, finding humor in play and seeing how many of us they could destroy in different interesting ways? Jason did not know, could not know, and his compulsion to search would only add to his suffering. Every learned facet of the universe only serving to show how insignificant he was, how everything was out of his control and he was ultimately powerless. More than that, Jason thought. Meaningless was a more apt description, an existence with a murky cause and null effect. Jason could not find the motivation to raise himself from the place in which he lied on the ground. Hey, is that you, Jason? Are you okay? It was the voice of Isabel. It was getting closer, more worried, as the words continued. Yes. Jason rasped, his voice dry from exhaustion and thirst and his previous struggles to suck air into his restricted lungs. I'm okay. He did not raise from the ground. Are you sure? You don't seem to be okay. You're on the ground. I... I don't know. I don't think I'm injured in any way. I just feel bad. Numb and empty, I guess. Isabel knew of this pain. Most people eventually know of this pain. It was not a physical pain, but a numbness, a lethargy set into the body. The melancholy was more worrying than the sadness. Like the wound on her hand. When it was screaming in pain, it was bad, to be sure. The wound would have taken long to heal. But when it went numb, that is when she truly worried. Because now she doesn't know if it will ever heal, if it will ever return working proper, like it used to. Jason's melancholy was like that. Only time would tell. You defeated Jonah, though. You should at least feel accomplished in that. She put a hand on his shoulder. I didn't even, though. Jason answered. He was not looking at her. He kept gazing in the direction of the sky, fixating on nothing in particular. I merely interrupted a game they were playing. They could have accomplished anything they had wanted to, but their only goal was to play with us, as powerless toys. I didn't accomplish anything. You're wrong, Jason. Whether or not the world was saved because you banished the monster through your own will, or just made them lose the game based on their own arbitrary rules, doesn't really matter. Your actions still led to the result of the world being saved, and there being a tomorrow to look forward to. Simon and me, we would not have been able to accomplish any of this without your help. It's funny. I never would have imagined that boy I met a few days ago would be strong enough to accomplish what he did today. But... Jason raised to a sitting position next to Isabel. What happens when those beings come back, when others like them come back, and for some reason they don't find us amusing enough anymore to not outright slaughter us, replace us with something else? I don't know, Jason. I think that these monsters of the Akashic, these figures of our unconscious being reflected in different ways into the beings we saw today, I think they depend on us in a way. I think only exists due to that area of connected thought between all people, where deities and monsters roam through imagination. But that is only a thought, and plus, it doesn't really matter either way. The problem is not the monster themselves at this point. The problem is that you are focusing on things outside your control. What you should be focusing on is what you can control. What it is you can create positive change in. Don't worry about the past or those monsters you are imagining that could come and destroy the world, because if anything, you are merely giving them more sway over you. Try to view every new thing you see going forward in a fresher perspective. Then ask yourself, is there anything I can change? And then you should ask how. That is how you live a life creating positive change. Or just be like most people and live a life that makes you happy. It will echo through the collective unconscious into the Akashic, creating, I don't know, fairies instead of demons. That's great, Jason said, laughing at this. Like a comic book heroine. It reminds me of something someone told me before. Who was that? It was nobody that you know. Jason was thinking of what Coatlicue had just told him in his dream. He imagined himself as a snake, scratching his withered husk of his skin away before slithering forward into a new day, with fresh skin. Sure, there would be some scars that last, some blemishes that remain no matter how many times hardship is shed, but those just remind us that our past was not served in a vacuum. Learn from those scars, take that knowledge and any agency our present condition may have allotted us, and do the best we can. But why? Jason asked. Why? Well, I suppose he reasoned. I'll find some other compulsion to pull me forward then as well. I could always introduce you to the esoteric order. The group of mages that took care of me helped foster what I know. I know they would take you in, especially with recommendations from me and Simon. I'll consider it. I'm not making any promises. But now to what is really important. Jason stopped to give Isabel a look, mainly for dramatic pause. You never struck me as a fairy person, though I guess I haven't known you that long. There's a lot of things you don't know about me. It was the first positive thing I could think of. Of course she's a fairy person. Isabel's a sweetheart. Zhao! Hey Simon, it's been a minute. Hey Jason, up we go. Thanks for putting an end to everything. Zhao, it's been so long. I'm so glad to see you. Same for me, Izzy. Watch my arm, please. From Chris Welleran. Thank you very much for playing. I guess in this case we'd be watching, though.